The men came for the ranch before the sun had fully risen. Evelyn Hart heard them first, boots scraping the porch planks, the low murmur of voices that didn't belong to any of the Silvercrest hands she'd come to know. She pressed herself against the kitchen doorframe and watched through the narrow window as 3 riders dismounted in the yard. The one in front wore a long duster coat the color of dried mud, and he was smiling. That smile was the worst thing about him. He pulled a folded document from his coat, held it up for no one in particular to see, and said, loud enough to carry through the glass, "Colton Ashford owes a debt he can't pay. We're here to collect the ranch." If that were your home, your only place left in the world, what would you do? The man tore the document in half and let the pieces fall into the dirt. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. 3 weeks earlier, Evelyn Hart had been standing on a train platform in Pittsburgh with $31, a carpet bag, and a letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had gone white. The letter was from a man named Gerald Fitch, who operated a placement agency out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. It promised a position as head cook at a prestigious cattle operation, Silvercrest Ranch, owned by one Colton Ashford. Room, board, and a wage of $14 a month. The letter used words like exceptional opportunity and frontier prosperity and a new beginning for a woman of good character. Evelyn was 26 years old. Her father had died in February, and the bank had taken the house in March. And by April, she had discovered that the man she'd trusted to handle her father's affairs had been helping himself to the estate for the better part of 2 years. She had no siblings. Her mother had passed when Evelyn was 11. There was an aunt in Baltimore who had made it quietly clear that charity had its limits. So she'd answered the advertisement. She'd sent her response to Mr. Gerald Fitch with trembling hands and waited for 17 days before the letter came back. Exceptional opportunity. She'd read it again on the train west, somewhere past Chicago, while the landscape outside the window flattened and widened into something she'd never imagined. She'd read it again in Cheyenne while waiting for the stagecoach connection that would take her north. She kept expecting the words to change, to reveal some flaw she'd missed, some condition buried in the language that would explain why a ranch as prosperous as Silvercrest needed to import a cook from Pennsylvania. The stagecoach left Cheyenne at 7 in the morning with 4 passengers. Evelyn sat beside a dry goods merchant who fell asleep before they'd cleared the city limits and a young couple heading to a homestead claim who held hands across the seat and spoke to each other in voices too low for anyone else to hear. The driver was a leathery man of 50 or so who had not offered his name and did not seem to want theirs. The country north of Cheyenne was not what she'd expected. She'd read about Wyoming in a geography book in her father's library. The Rockies, the High Plains, the cattle trails. The book had made it sound organized, almost manageable. The actual Wyoming pressed against the stagecoach windows with a kind of indifference that felt almost personal. The sky was too large. The land rolled in every direction without asking permission. She caught herself gripping the letter in her coat pocket just to have something solid to hold. They were perhaps 2 hours north of Cheyenne when the driver shouted something she didn't catch, and the coach lurched hard to the right. The young woman across from her screamed. The merchant jolted awake and immediately grabbed for the door handle, which was the wrong instinct. Evelyn braced both hands against the seat frame and felt the wheels bite into something uneven, and then the coach slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, and she heard voices outside that were not the driver's. 4 riders. She could see them through the window. They had bandanas pulled up over their faces, which struck her as almost theatrical, like something from a cheap novel. 2 of them flanked the lead horse. 1 rode around to the driver's side. The 4th positioned himself directly in front of the coach, with a rifle held across his saddle at a casual angle that made it somehow more frightening than if he'd been pointing it. "Down from there," the 4th one said to the driver. His voice was flat and unhurried. "Everybody out." The merchant was already sweating through his collar. The young husband put himself in front of his wife, which was a decent instinct, though there wasn't much room to act on it in the cramped interior. Evelyn looked at the 4 riders and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that panicking would not improve anything. She stepped out of the coach. The air smelled like sage and something metallic. She filed that detail away and looked at the rider nearest her, the one who'd spoken. He was watching the driver climb down from the box with the same flat attention a man might give to livestock being sorted. Bags out, he said. Jewelry, money. Keep it moving. The merchant fumbled with his case. The young wife had gone very still, which Evelyn recognized as its own kind of intelligence. Evelyn held her carpet bag against her side and calculated. $31. The letter. A change of clothes, her mother's cameo brooch, and a small book of household accounts she'd kept during the years she managed her father's home. She was not going to hand any of it to a man in a bandana. This was probably not a smart decision. She understood that even as she made it. The nearest rider moved toward her, hand extended. She looked at his hand and then looked at his face, what she could see of it above the bandana, and she said very quietly, "No." A beat of silence. Even the merchant stopped fumbling. "Lady," the rider said, "I'm not asking." "I understand that," Evelyn said. What happened next came from the tree line to the east, and it happened fast. A gunshot, single, sharp, cracked the air above them, and the fourth rider's horse spooked sideways. Then two more riders came out of the trees at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was not casual either, and the man nearest Evelyn took a half step back, and the whole arrangement shifted in a way she could feel without fully understanding. The riders from the trees were not bandits. The first one was large, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low. He rode with the kind of ease that meant he'd spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. The second was younger, barely 20, with a rifle already at his shoulder. The four bandits looked at each other. The calculation took about 4 seconds. They ran, not galloped away dramatically, just turned their horses and moved off at a pace that communicated they'd decided this particular road wasn't worth the trouble today. The flat-voiced one glanced back once, and Evelyn memorized the set of his shoulders because she was the kind of person who memorized things. The large rider pulled up a few yards from the coach and looked down at the scattered scene. The shaking merchant, the young couple still pressed together, the driver who'd gone pale under his tan. Then his eyes settled on Evelyn, who was still holding her carpetbag against her side and had not moved. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. "You always tell road agents no?" "First time," she said. Seemed like the right call. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "Colton Ashford," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "That's my name." He gestured in the general direction north. "Silvercrest Ranch is mine. Where were you headed?" Evelyn looked up at the man she'd traveled 1,500 miles to work for and thought that this was either a remarkable coincidence or Wyoming was smaller than it looked. "Silvercrest Ranch," she said. "I'm Evelyn Hart. I've been hired as your head cook." The younger rider lowered his rifle. Colton Ashford's expression didn't change exactly, but something moved behind it, a flicker of something she couldn't name. "Is that right?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "I have the letter." He looked at the letter she'd produced from her coat pocket, then at her face, then back at the road the bandits had taken. "We'll sort it out at the ranch," he said. "Can you ride?" "I've never ridden a horse in my life," Evelyn said. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "Right. You can take the coach." Silvercrest Ranch was not what the letter had described, which was to say it was considerably more than the letter had described. The main house was 2 stories of solid timber and stone that had clearly been built by someone with money and the intention to keep it. The outbuildings spread out in organized rows behind it, bunkhouses, barns, storage structures she couldn't name. Cattle grazed on the surrounding hills in numbers that made her understand for the first time what the word empire meant when applied to a ranch. There were workers everywhere. Cowboys moving between buildings, hands crossing the yard, a woman hanging laundry on a line who paused to look at the arriving coach with undisguised curiosity. Colton rode ahead and was off his horse before the coach stopped. He handed the reins to a boy who appeared from nowhere and walked toward the house with the air of a man with 17 things to do before noon. Evelyn stepped out of the coach and stood in the yard and breathed the unfamiliar air, pine and cattle and something like distance, if distance had a smell, and reminded herself that she had gotten this far. A stout woman of about 50 emerged from the house, drying her hands on an apron. She had iron gray hair and the kind of face that had seen a great deal and chosen to keep most of it to itself. "Mrs. Crane," Colton said, "this is Miss Hart. She's come about the cook's position." Mrs. Crane looked at Evelyn with an expression that managed to be neither welcoming nor hostile, just assessing, the way you might look at a piece of equipment you weren't sure would hold up. She said. Could you get her settled in the guest room off the kitchen? Guest room, Mrs. Crane repeated, making two words carry the weight of an opinion. For now, Colton said. He turned and went inside. Mrs. Crane looked at Evelyn for another moment, then stepped back from the doorway. Come in then, she said. You'll want to wash the road off before anything else. The kitchen was large and well equipped by frontier standards. A proper iron stove, a pump at the sink, shelves of dry goods, copper pots hanging from a rack. Evelyn took it in with the automatic inventory she'd developed over years of running her father's household. Enough to work with, more than enough. The position, Evelyn said to Mrs. Crane's back as the woman showed her down a short hallway. Was it recently vacated, or... There is no position, Mrs. Crane said. Evelyn stopped walking. I'm sorry? Mrs. Crane turned to face her. She had the directness of a woman who'd stopped softening things years ago. Gerald Fitch runs a placement agency in Cheyenne. He advertises positions at ranches across the territory. Some of them are real. Some of them, she shrugged. He takes a fee from the applicants for the placement. The ranch never agreed to any of it. Evelyn heard herself say, very quietly, that isn't possible. The letter came from Fitch, not from Silvercrest. Mr. Ashford never sent for anyone. Mrs. Crane's voice wasn't unkind, precisely. It was the voice of someone delivering information that needed delivering. You're not the first young woman he's sent out this way. You probably won't be the last. Evelyn stood in the hallway of a house she'd traveled 1,500 miles to reach, and felt the floor do something strange beneath her feet. Not literally, the floor was solid enough. It was the sense of something she'd been standing on dissolving. $31, no position, no family. The stage back to Cheyenne would cost $8, and that was if she left tomorrow, and she had no idea what she'd do when she got there. Where's the nearest town? She asked. Harlan, 12 miles south. Mrs. Crane studied her. The stage goes through twice a week. When's the next one? 3 days? 3 days. Evelyn did the arithmetic that she always did when faced with a problem. Not panicking, just calculating. $31 minus $8 for the stage. $23 to rebuild a life in a city she'd never been to, with no references from a position she'd never actually held, having spent her last real savings on a journey based on a fraudulent letter. She thought about Gerald Fitch and his office in Cheyenne, and the words exceptional opportunity, and felt something move through her that was not quite rage but was in the same neighborhood. The guest room, she said, off the kitchen. Could I see it? Mrs. Crane showed her a small, clean room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the yard. It had a latch on the door and a hook for hanging clothes and a wash basin on a stand. It was the most modest room she'd stayed in since her father's estate had been sold, and it was also, at this particular moment, exactly what she needed. Thank you, she said. I'll speak with Mr. Ashford after I've washed up. Mrs. Crane's expression shifted very slightly. Most women in your position would be asking what the next stage costs. I know what the next stage costs, Evelyn said. I have 3 days before it leaves. I'd rather not waste them. She found Colton Ashford in the study off the main hallway, standing over a desk covered in papers with the look of a man who understood cattle significantly better than he understood paperwork. He glanced up when she knocked on the open door. Miss Hart. Mr. Ashford. She came into the room without waiting to be invited, because waiting would have meant giving him room to dismiss her before she'd made her case. I understand the position I was told I had doesn't exist. He sat back in his chair. I heard the same thing this afternoon. Gerald Fitch took a fee from me, she said, $20, in exchange for placing me in a position that you never agreed to fill. I know about Fitch. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, but related to it. This has happened before. 2 other women you've turned away. I didn't turn them away. He paused. I gave them money for the stage home. That's very generous, Evelyn said, and kept her voice perfectly level. It doesn't solve the problem. He looked at her steadily. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had been weathered into its final form by years outdoors. Not handsome exactly, but solid, reliable looking. His hands on the desk were the hands of a man who did physical work, even with the ring of prosperity around him. "What do you propose?" he asked. "Your financial records," she said, "are a catastrophe." He blinked. "Excuse me?" I could see the papers from the doorway. I wasn't trying to read them. I'm good at reading things from a distance. My father was a businessman. I managed his accounts for 6 years before he died. Your records are unorganized to the point of danger, Mr. Ashford. She folded her hands in front of her. I'm not asking you to take me on as a charity case. I'm asking you to let me work. I can cook. I'm a competent cook, not an exceptional one, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I can also manage a household, keep proper financial records, and organize your accounts in a way that will save you money within 90 days. The silence that followed was long enough that she heard the clock on the mantel ticking. That's a specific claim, he said. I can be specific because I mean it. She met his eyes. 3 months. If I haven't demonstrated value, I'll take the stage home and we'll call it even. Colton Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the papers on his desk. Then he looked back at her. The desk in the corner of this room, he said slowly. Nobody uses it. Hasn't been used in 2 years. Then it's available, she said. The accounts go back 4 years. Some of them are... He rubbed the back of his neck. They're not organized. I gathered. Another silence. The wage is $10 a month to start. If you're right about the 90 days, we'll revisit. 12, she said. He looked at her. 11. 12, she said again, pleasantly. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. 12, he said. Fine. The first week was harder than she'd let herself anticipate. The paperwork was worse than she'd seen from the doorway. 4 years of ranch accounts kept in 3 different systems by 3 different hands. Invoices mixed with correspondence, cattle tallies written on the backs of receipts. There was money being lost. She could see the shape of it even before she could quantify it. In feed purchases that didn't match the cattle numbers. In wages that didn't align with the worker roles. In supply contracts that hadn't been renegotiated in years. She worked at the corner desk from first light until the household needed her in the kitchen, then returned after dinner while the lamplight held. Mrs. Crane watched her with an expression that had shifted, by the end of the 3rd day, from cautious to something closer to respect, though the woman clearly wasn't ready to announce it. The ranch hands were another question. They were polite enough, frontier politeness, which meant they didn't say anything rude to her face and reserved their opinions for the bunkhouse. She heard the word schoolmarm twice in the first 3 days, both times spoken just loud enough to be intended as overheard. She did not react to it. On the 4th day, she found a discrepancy in the feed accounts large enough to suggest either a mathematical error or someone taking advantage. She checked it 3 times before bringing it to Colton. He was in the barn when she found him, checking over a horse that had come up lame. He looked at the papers she held out without immediately taking them. Found something, she said. He took the papers, read them. His jaw tightened in a way she was already learning to read as controlled anger. This is from the Bennett supply account. The figures don't match any of the delivery records I can find, she said. Either they're delivering less than they're billing, or someone on this end is adjusting the records. I don't know which yet. Colton looked at the papers for a long moment, then handed them back. Keep looking, he said. Don't talk to anyone about it yet. I wasn't planning to. She turned to go. Miss Hart. She looked back. He was still watching the lame horse, not her, and his voice had a different quality than it had in the study, less formal. The other women Fitch sent. I gave them the stage money because I didn't know what else to do. Felt like the right thing. It probably was, she said. None of them. He stopped, started again. None of them looked at my desk like it personally offended them. It did personally offend me, she said, honestly. I spent 6 years keeping books for my father's business. What I saw on that desk was 6 years of work undone. He turned then and looked at her directly, and there was something in that look that she filed away the same way she'd filed the set of the bandit's shoulders, for later, when she had more information. The Bennett supply thing, he said. I've had a feeling about it for a while, couldn't see it clearly. I can see it clearly, she said. Give me a few more days. 8 days in, a ranch hand named Pete, big, slow-spoken, with the kind of face that made it difficult to tell whether he was thinking hard or not at all, appeared in the doorway of the study while she was working. Boss says you're managing the household now, he said. Along with the accounts, she said without looking up. Mrs. Crane manages the household. Mrs. Crane manages the kitchen and the house staff, Evelyn said. I'm managing the supply orders, the worker scheduling, and the financial records. Different things. Pete considered this. You're from the East. Pennsylvania, she said. You ever been on a cattle ranch before? No. She looked up then. Is that a problem, Pete? He blinked at the use of his name. She'd been learning them, quietly, all week. No, ma'am, he said slowly. Just different. Most useful things are, she said. He left. She went back to the Bennett supply accounts and found, 4 pages deeper in, what she'd been looking for. A pattern of adjustments made in the same handwriting every 6 weeks that didn't match any of the original invoices. She sat back in the chair and looked at the page and thought about who on a ranch this size would have access to the supply accounts and the motivation to skim from them. And she thought about the flat-voiced bandit on the road and the way he'd looked back over his shoulder when his crew rode off. And she thought that Wyoming had a way of connecting things you weren't expecting to connect. She wrote it down, all of it. Then she locked the papers in the desk drawer she'd asked Colton for a key to on day 1, a request that had made him look at her with something between amusement and approval, and went to help with supper. Outside, the Wyoming sky had gone from blue to a purple. She didn't have a word for yet, wide and indifferent and enormous above the hills. Somewhere in the middle distance, cattle were moving. She could hear them through the open kitchen window while she chopped onions and thought about fraud and distance and $31, and about how much further she'd already come than she'd expected. On the 10th day, she told Colton what she'd found. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he listened to everything important, fully, without the fidgeting that meant someone was already preparing their response. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Hector Dunn, he said. His voice was flat in a way that was different from the bandit's flatness. This was the flatness of a man keeping something very controlled. He's been with this ranch 7 years. I know, she said. I found his personnel record. 7 years. Colton stood and moved to the window. The amounts? Over 3 years, the total discrepancy is approximately $480, she said. Possibly more. I haven't finished with the older records. $480 was not a small sum. She watched him absorb it, the way his shoulders held a tension that didn't show anywhere else, the way he pressed one hand flat against the window frame. I'll need to verify it myself before I do anything, he said. Of course, she said. I've marked every discrepancy. The original invoices are in the left stack, the adjusted figures in the right. He turned from the window and looked at her. You organized this in 10 days. I organized the relevant portion in 10 days. The rest will take another few weeks. Something in his expression shifted, and she recognized it this time because she'd seen it before. On the road, when she'd said no to the bandit. It was the look of a man recalibrating what he'd expected. Most people I hire, he said, I tell them what to do. I work better with a clear problem and open access to the files, she said. You gave me both. I gave you a desk and $12 a month, he said. That's not the same as open access. You didn't lock anything, she said. That's open access, in practice. He made the almost laugh sound again. She decided she liked that sound. It was more honest than a polished laugh would have been. I'll look at the records tonight, he said. If it checks out, we'll deal with Dunn tomorrow. I'd suggest doing it quietly, she said. I don't know yet whether there's anyone else involved. He nodded, slowly, like he was turning that over. You don't trust Easy, do you? I trusted Gerald Fitch, she said. That was an expensive education. The look on his face then was something she didn't quite have a name for either, like the Wyoming sky at dusk. Something familiar that had been made unfamiliar by the new context. Fair enough, he said. She went back to the desk. He stood at the window a moment longer, looking out at the hills where the last of the light was doing whatever light does when no one has given it a word yet. Outside, the cattle moved through the dark in numbers she couldn't count, steady and indifferent, and the night came down over Silvercrest Ranch the way Wyoming nights did, suddenly, completely, as if they'd been waiting just behind the horizon for the signal to advance. Hector Dunn did not go quietly. That was the first thing Evelyn learned about confrontations on a cattle ranch. They were never as clean as the paperwork that preceded them. Colton had verified her figures the night before, sitting at the corner desk with a lamp pulled close and his jaw set in that controlled anger way she'd begun to read as reliably as punctuation. He hadn't said much when he finished, just stacked the papers, locked the drawer, and told her to be in the main house before 7 the next morning. She was there at 6:45. Hector Dunn was a lean man with a mustache that had once been fashionable and now just looked like something he'd forgotten to update. He'd been the Silvercrest supply coordinator for 7 years, which meant he'd been skimming the Bennett supply accounts for at least 3 of them, which meant he'd made something close to $500 off a man who'd trusted him with a key to the supply barn and the authority to sign off on deliveries. Colton called him into the study without preamble. Evelyn sat at the corner desk with the account books open in front of her, and she watched Hector Dunn's eyes find her the moment he came through the door. Not Colton, her. And she saw him understand in the space of 2 seconds exactly what had happened. "Hector," Colton said, "sit down." Dunn didn't sit. He looked at the account books and then at Evelyn and then at Colton, and his face went through 3 different calculations before settling on indignation. "Whatever she told you." "Sit down," Colton said again. Same tone, just slightly more weight in it. Dunn sat. What followed was not dramatic. That was the second thing Evelyn learned. Colton laid out the discrepancies, dates, amounts, adjusted figures, in a voice that stayed even throughout, and Dunn denied it for approximately 4 minutes before the specific detail of the handwriting analysis made further denial pointless. The indignation collapsed. What replaced it was something uglier, a kind of cornered resentment that looked for somewhere to go and found Evelyn. "You've been here 2 weeks, Dunn said to her. 2 weeks, and you're already—" 10 days, she said. He stared at her. "What?" "I've been here 10 days, not 2 weeks. It was a small correction. She made it anyway, because accuracy mattered, and because she'd learned that letting small inaccuracies stand was how larger ones got established. Dunn's mouth worked for a moment. Then he looked at Colton. "You're going to take the word of some woman Fitch sent out here over a man who's given you 7 years. "I'm going to take the word of the account books," Colton said. She just read them. Dunn left Silvercrest that afternoon with his possessions in 2 saddlebags and no reference letter. Colton paid him what remained of his legitimate wages, every penny of it, and Evelyn thought that said something about the man, though she wasn't sure yet exactly what. She was reorganizing the supply files afterward when Pete appeared in the study doorway again. He looked at the empty chair where Hector Dunn had sat that morning, then at Evelyn, then at the ceiling for some reason. "Hector's gone," he said. "Yes," she said. "He'd been here 7 years." "I know." Pete was quiet for a moment. "You find anything else?" She looked up at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she appreciated. "I'm still working through the older records," she said. "Why?" "No reason," he said. Then, after a pause, "The Bennett supply contract hasn't been renegotiated since Hector took it over." "I noticed that." "The Caldwell operation renegotiated theirs last spring, got a better rate." She set down her pen. "How do you know that?" Pete shrugged, which on his large frame was its own kind of statement. "Caldwell's foreman drinks at the same place I do." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "What's your official role here, Pete?" "Head wrangler. Do you want to be useful in a different capacity, or are you just making conversation?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. "Bit of both," he said. "Then come back when you have specific information," she said. "Vague is not useful to me." He left. She went back to the files, but she filed Pete away in the same mental cabinet she kept for things that might become relevant later. The town of Harlan was 12 miles south, which in Wyoming meant it was both near and not near, depending on the weather and the reason for going. Evelyn went for the first time at the end of her second week, riding in the supply wagon with a hand named Cal, who had a habit of talking to his horses in a low, continuous murmur that he seemed unaware of and that Evelyn found oddly comforting. She needed to speak with the bank. Silvercrest held accounts at the Harlan Territorial Bank, and the account records she'd found in the files were, at minimum, 18 months out of date. She'd written a letter to the bank manager requesting current statements, and the response, taking 4 days to travel 12 miles, which told her something about Harlan's postal efficiency, had suggested she come in person. The bank was a 2-story building on the main street that was doing its best to look permanent. The manager was a man named Silas Greer, who had the handshake of someone who'd decided early that a firm grip was a substitute for transparency. He showed her into his office and offered her coffee, which she accepted, and then looked at her over the rim of his own cup with an expression that managed to be both polite and skeptical. "You're managing the Silver Crest accounts," he said. Not quite a question. "I'm managing the ranch accounts, yes," she said. "Mr. Ashford is aware I'm here." "I don't doubt it." He set his cup down. "I just wasn't aware Mr. Ashford had taken on a—" He paused. "An accounts manager." "Financial administrator," she said pleasantly. "The accounts manager title would imply I manage only the accounts. I manage rather more than that." Greer blinked. He was not accustomed, she judged, to being corrected on word choice. "Of course, the statements you requested." He opened a drawer and produced a folder. "There are some items I'd want to discuss with Mr. Ashford directly." "You're welcome to," she said, "though I should mention that Mr. Ashford has authorized me to review and discuss all Silvercrest financial matters. If you'd prefer a letter to that effect, I can have one here by Thursday." Another blink. "That won't be necessary." The statements told a story that was more complicated than she'd expected. Silvercrest was profitable, genuinely, substantially profitable, but the cash flow management was a mess. Money was sitting in the main account doing nothing when it should have been working. Loan arrangements that predated Colton's full ownership of the ranch were still being serviced at rates that made no sense in the current environment. She asked Greer about two specific notes, older debts, carried over from the previous owner, and watched his expression shift in a way that was only slightly too controlled. "Those are long-standing arrangements," he said. "I can see that," she said. "What I can't see is why the interest rate on the northern parcel note was increased in 1882 without a corresponding change in the loan terms." Silas Greer looked at her. The controlled expression required more effort now. "There may have been a rate adjustment at the time." "There was," she said. "I have the original note. The adjustment wasn't authorized under the terms of the agreement." The silence in the office was a different quality than the silences she'd experienced at Silvercrest. This one had a harder edge. "Miss Hart," Greer said, "these are complex financial instruments. Perhaps when Mr. Ashford is available—" "Mr. Ashford is available at the ranch," she said. "I'm available right now, and I'm asking a specific question about a specific document." She placed the copy she'd made on the desk between them. "I'd like an explanation." Greer looked at the document. His jaw moved slightly, as if he were working something between his back teeth. "I'll need to pull the original bank records," he said. "It may take some time." "I'll wait," she said. She waited. It took 40 minutes, during which she drank 2 cups of coffee and reviewed the account statements she'd been given and made notes in the margin of her ledger with a pencil she'd brought because she'd learned not to rely on other people's writing instruments. When Greer came back, he had a folder that was thicker than it needed to be and an expression that had settled into something resembling professional neutrality. The explanation, when it came, was technically coherent and almost certainly incomplete. There had been a rate adjustment, he said, tied to a broader territorial banking regulation that had been in effect briefly in 1882. The original note terms had included a provision, buried in the secondary clauses, that allowed for adjustment under certain regulatory conditions. Evelyn read the secondary clause 3 times. It was there. Just barely there. Written in the kind of language that was specifically designed to be there without appearing to be there. She thought about who had drafted that original note and what they'd understood about the person signing it, and she felt the same particular cold anger she'd felt looking at Gerald Fitch's letter. "I'll need a copy of the original note with all clauses," she said. "Of course," Greer said. She rode back to Silvercrest in the supply wagon with Cal murmuring to his horses and the folder on her lap, and the Wyoming afternoon going gold and wide around her. She thought about Silas Greer's expression when she'd produced the copy of the document. She thought about what it meant that the rate adjustment had been made 18 months after Colton took full ownership of the ranch. Not before, not during the transfer period, but after, when he was already managing an enormous operation and had less time to examine old paperwork. She thought that Wyoming was turning out to have considerably more in common with Pittsburgh than she'd expected. She told Colton about the banknote that evening. He listened in the same way he always listened to important things. Still, with his full attention, not interrupting. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the copy of the clause she'd placed on the desk. "I signed this," he said. You signed the original note, she said. You may not have signed the amended version, or you may have signed it without the clause being drawn to your attention specifically. He turned the paper over in his hands. Greer's been the bank manager here for 15 years. I know. He's well regarded in town. That's consistent with what I saw, she said. He's careful and he's practiced. The kind of person who doesn't make obvious errors. She paused. The kind of error that's not an error. Colton set the paper down. His hands were flat on the desk now, in the way she recognized as containing something. What do you want to do about it? I want a lawyer to look at the original note and the amended clause, she said. Is there one in Harlan? Warren Pell. He's decent. Will he tell you the truth, even if it's complicated? Colton considered. He'll tell me the truth. Whether it's complete is another question. Then I'd like to be present when you meet with him, she said. He looked up from the paper. You don't trust him either. I trust that he's honest with you, she said. I don't know yet whether he sees everything I see, and I'd rather be in the room. She met his eyes. I'm not suggesting you're incapable of managing your own affairs. I'm suggesting that having two sets of eyes on a legal document costs nothing. He held her gaze for a moment. Fair enough, he said, which was becoming something of a fixed phrase between them. Thursday. Pell's office. She nodded and gathered her papers. Miss Hart. She looked back. He was looking at the banknote again, not at her, and his voice had that different quality again, the non-formal one. How many things like this do you think are in those records? She considered the honest answer versus the kind answer, and chose the honest one because he was the kind of person who'd want it. At least 2 others I haven't finished tracing yet, she said. Possibly more. He absorbed that. How long would it take someone to set up something like the Greer note? If they were patient. Years, she said. You'd have to wait until the person was too busy or too tired to read carefully. You'd have to seem trustworthy in the meantime. She paused. You'd have to understand that someone building an empire has less time to watch their flanks the bigger the empire gets. That's a cold way to think about it, he said. It's how people who do this think about it, she said. I've seen it before. My father… She stopped, started again. My father's estate manager spent 4 years building our trust before he started taking money. He was very good at being trustworthy. Colton was looking at her now. Is that why Fitch's letter didn't destroy you when you found out it was a fraud? She hadn't thought about it in those terms. Maybe, she said, or maybe I'd already learned that rebuilding is just work, and work isn't the worst thing. He didn't respond to that. She left him with the banknote and went to the kitchen where Mrs. Crane was cleaning up after supper and washed her hands at the pump and stood at the window looking out at the dark yard and the dark hills beyond it, and thought about her father's estate manager and Gerald Fitch and Silas Greer and the particular human talent for wrapping harm in the appearance of normalcy. Then she dried her hands and went to bed because there was more to do tomorrow. The gossip started in the 3rd week. She knew it had been coming, a single woman of no particular local standing, brought in by Fitch's scheme and kept on by the territory's wealthiest bachelor. The story practically wrote itself. She heard the first version from Cal, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone who wanted her to have the information without wanting to be responsible for having given it. The version circulating in Harlan was that Evelyn Hart had come to Wyoming specifically to pursue Colton Ashford, that the Fitch letter was a convenient fiction she'd constructed, and that the financial work she was supposedly doing was cover for a campaign to secure herself a wealthy husband. She listened to Cal's careful summary and nodded and said, "Thank you," and went back to the supply invoices she'd been reviewing. It was Mrs. Crane who brought the second version, less carefully. She appeared in the study doorway that evening and said, "There's talk," in the tone of a woman delivering information she considered it her duty to deliver. "I heard," Evelyn said. "It's not the first time something like this has happened with Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Crane said. "Women have come before, not through Fitch, but there have been attempts." "I'm not attempting anything," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even. "I know that," Mrs. Crane said. "I'm telling you because you should know what people are saying, not because I believe it." She paused. "For what it's worth." Evelyn looked at her. Mrs. Crane's face was still doing its determined neutral thing, but there was something underneath it now that was closer to solidarity than anything she'd shown before. "It's worth something," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Mrs. Crane nodded once and went away. The gossip bothered her less than she'd expected, which bothered her slightly. She examined that reaction and concluded it was because she'd made her peace with being misunderstood years ago, when she was 19 and managing her father's accounts in Pittsburgh, and the business community had looked at a young woman reading supply contracts with a kind of bafflement that never quite hardened into respect. She'd stopped needing their respect somewhere around 22. She still wanted to do the work well. Those were different things. What bothered her more was the reaction to the gossip, specifically a visit on the fourth week from a rancher named Douglas Crane, no relation to Mrs. Crane, who arrived at Silvercrest on a Tuesday morning while Colton was out checking fence lines. Douglas Crane was a heavy-set man in his 50s who owned the second-largest operation in the area and who had the manner of someone accustomed to filling rooms without being asked. He asked to see Mr. Ashford. She told him Mr. Ashford was out. "Then I'll wait," he said, and sat in the main room without being invited to. She went back to work. 40 minutes later, when it became clear that she was not going to come out and make conversation, and Colton was not going to appear, Douglas Crane came to the study doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd decided that the polite approach wasn't landing. "You're the one managing the accounts," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's an unusual arrangement." "It suits this ranch's needs," she said. Douglas Crane looked around the study, at the organized stacks of papers, the open ledger books, the systematic order that had replaced the chaos she'd found here 4 weeks ago. "Colton's a good man," he said. "One of the best in the territory. He doesn't always—" He stopped. "He doesn't always see things coming until they're already here." "Is that an observation about me?" she asked. "It's a general observation," Crane said, "about people who come from the East." She set down her pen. "Mr. Crane," she said, "if you have a concern about how Silvercrest is being managed, I'd suggest raising it with Mr. Ashford when he returns. If you have a concern about me specifically, you could try raising it directly, which I'd respect more than the current approach." Douglas Crane stared at her. He had the look of a man who hadn't been spoken to this way in some time and wasn't sure how to process it. "You've got nerve," he said finally. It wasn't quite a compliment. "Frequently," she said. "Was there anything else?" He left before Colton returned. She debated whether to mention the visit and decided yes, because omitting it would be a form of management she didn't practice. Colton listened and then said, "Douglas is—" He stopped. "He looks out for Silvercrest because Silvercrest's success affects the whole valley. Everyone's prices, the rail contracts, the grazing rights, it's connected." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not suggesting he's wrong to be interested. I'm suggesting that if he has concerns, he should voice them clearly." Colton looked at her for a moment. "What did you say to him exactly?" "That if he had a concern about how the ranch was being managed, he should raise it with you. And if he had a concern about me specifically, he should say so directly." "And what did he say?" "That I had nerve." Colton's mouth moved, the almost laugh. "That's probably the nicest thing Douglas Crane has said to someone he doesn't approve of in 20 years, he said. "I'll take it," she said. The Bennett supply renegotiation happened in week 5, and it did not go smoothly, which she'd expected. She'd drafted new contract terms based on current market rates she'd gathered from 3 different sources, including Pete's informal intelligence from the Caldwell foreman and 2 responses to letters she'd sent to supply operations in Cheyenne. The new terms would save Silvercrest approximately $200 a year on feed and equipment costs. The Bennett supply representative, a man named Tom Aldis, who made the ride up from Cheyenne for the meeting, arrived with the confidence of someone who'd been doing business with Silvercrest under favorable terms for 4 years and expected to continue. Colton had asked her to handle the initial conversation. She'd laid the new terms out on the table with the comparative pricing data beside them, and Aldis had looked at them, and then at her, and then at the door, as if checking whether Colton was about to come in and make this a different kind of meeting. "These are quite different from the current agreement," Aldis said. "The current agreement is 4 years old and hasn't been reviewed in that time," she said. "Market rates have changed. Silvercrest is an important account." "Then you'll want to keep it," she said pleasantly. "These terms are in line with what comparable operations are currently paying. If Bennett can meet them, we'd like to continue the relationship. If not, I have 2 other suppliers in Cheyenne who have expressed interest." Aldis looked at the comparative pricing. He took his time looking at it, which she read as a sign that the numbers were accurate, and he knew it. I'd need to take this back to our principal, he said. Of course. We'd want an answer within 10 days. After Aldous left, Colton appeared from the hallway where, she was fairly certain, he'd been listening for the last 10 minutes. 2 other suppliers, he said. I have their names and preliminary rates, she said. I wrote to them 2 weeks ago. I didn't know whether you'd want to pursue it, but I thought having alternatives was better than not having them. He looked at the draft contract on the table. You wrote to competing suppliers 2 weeks ago. It seemed prudent. Without asking me. She met his eyes. I didn't commit to anything. I gathered information. Would you have preferred I ask permission to write a letter? He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not anger, something more complicated. No, he said. I'd have preferred you tell me you were doing it. That's fair, she said. I'll do that going forward. He nodded. She thought he might say something, but he didn't. He picked up the contract draft and read through it with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, and she went back to the main accounts and let the afternoon do what afternoons did. What she hadn't anticipated was the way the ranch hands shifted around her during that 5th week. Not hostile, she'd been braced for hostile and had her responses ready. This was subtler. Pete started appearing at the study door with actual information, specific and useful, offered in the same low-key way he'd mentioned the Caldwell contract. A hand named Rosa, who worked in the kitchen alongside Mrs. Crane and had looked at Evelyn for the first 2 weeks with pure suspicion, appeared one morning with a question about whether the kitchen supply orders could be routed through Evelyn's system instead of handled separately. It would be more efficient, Rosa said, in the tone of someone who had thought this through but wasn't sure how it would land. It would, Evelyn agreed. Yes, let's do that. Rosa nodded and went away, and Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway 5 minutes later with an expression that said the whole thing had been Mrs. Crane's idea and Rosa had been the test run, which Evelyn found more endearing than she expected. Kitchen orders by the 1st of each month, Evelyn said, before Mrs. Crane could say anything. Give me a list and I'll fold it into the main supply run. We've been doing it by the week, Mrs. Crane said. Monthly is more efficient and gives us better negotiating position on bulk orders, Evelyn said. But I'd want your input on what needs to be ordered weekly anyway, perishables and such. It's your kitchen. Mrs. Crane looked at her for a moment. Fine, she said. Monthly. She left, and Evelyn sat at the corner desk in the study that was starting to feel, in some unexamined way, like hers. And she thought that earning the loyalty of people who had reason to distrust you was one of the slower kinds of work, but it was also one of the more durable kinds. The Warren Pell meeting in Harlan happened on a Thursday, as Colton had said. Pell was a compact man of 60, with a precise way of speaking and glasses he kept having to push back up his nose, and he looked at the banknote clause with the careful attention of someone who'd seen similar things before and wanted to be sure before he said so. Evelyn had brought her own copy of the original note and the amendment. She'd also brought a 2-page summary of the discrepancy she'd written the night before, organized in the way she organized everything, clearly, specifically, without speculation. Pell read the summary first, then the notes, then the summary again. This is well prepared, he said, in a tone that had clearly started as surprised and been corrected midway. Thank you, she said. He looked at Colton. Where did you... She works for me, Colton said. What's your read on the note? Pell pushed his glasses up. The clause is technically present in the amendment, he said. Buried, but present. Enforcement would depend on whether the court considered the amendment properly disclosed at signing. He paused. The rate adjustment it allowed has cost you, he ran a quick calculation, approximately $340 over 3 years. Can it be challenged? Evelyn asked. Pell looked at her, recalibrating again. Potentially. The disclosure question is the central issue. If you can demonstrate that the clause wasn't drawn to Mr. Ashford's attention at signing, it wasn't, Colton said. I'd have noticed it. Do you have any record of the signing meeting? Any correspondence beforehand? I'll look, Evelyn said. I haven't finished with the pre-1881 records yet. Pell looked between them. You have a thorough operation here, he said to Colton, but with the careful phrasing of a man who was not sure the statement fully applied to the person he was directing it at. I have good people, Colton said, and he said it without the slight qualification she'd half expected, which she filed away in the cabinet labeled things to think about later. On the ride back to Silvercrest, she'd ridden out with Colton this time, on a horse that Mrs. Crane had quietly confirmed was steady, which turned out to mean it would tolerate a rider who didn't entirely know what they were doing. She thought about Silas Greer and his too-controlled expression and the years of careful positioning it had taken to build the kind of trust that made a buried clause possible. "You're thinking about Greer," Colton said. She looked at him. They were riding side by side on the road south, the afternoon wide and blue around them. "How did you know?" "You do something with your face when you're working through something you don't like," he said. "Your jaw goes a certain way." She was not entirely comfortable with the idea that he'd been reading her face closely enough to notice. "I was thinking about how long it must have taken," she said, "to build the kind of trust that lets you slip something like that past someone." "Years," he said. "Greer's been—" He paused. "He's been a fixture here since before my time. My father did business with him." She hadn't known that. "I'm sorry," she said, because she understood what it meant. Not just the money, but the specific betrayal of long familiarity. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be right about the pre-1881 records." "I intend to be," she said. The road curved north, and the Silvercrest Hills came into view above the tree line, and the cattle were moving on the far slopes in that slow, indifferent way that she was starting to find oddly steadying. "For what it's worth," Colton said, and he said it to the road ahead rather than to her, "Douglas Crane came to see me after his visit here." "I assumed he would," she said. "He said—" Another pause. He had a way of pausing that was about choosing words rather than finding them, she'd noticed. "He said you were either exactly what you appeared to be or the most sophisticated operator he'd encountered in 30 years of ranching." "And which did he think it was?" "He said he hadn't decided." Colton glanced at her. "I told him it wasn't a difficult question." She held her response for a moment because there was something in the way he'd said it that required more careful handling than she was always sure she had. "What did you say it was?" she asked. "I said you were exactly what you appeared to be," he said, "which is someone who doesn't waste much time on things that aren't the point." She thought about that for a while as the road ran north under the wide Wyoming sky, and she thought it was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in years, and she didn't say so out loud, because that felt like the kind of response that wasn't the point either. They rode back to Silvercrest in a silence that was, she realized somewhere along the last mile, entirely comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't need filling, that two people arrived at not by planning it, but by having already said the things that needed saying and found that the rest could wait. The gate of Silvercrest came into view. The hands in the yard went about their work. Mrs. Crane appeared briefly in the doorway of the main house, assessed the situation, and went back inside. There was more to do. There was always more to do. But for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach at the Silvercrest gate with $31 and a fraudulent letter and the specific kind of stubbornness that had kept her upright through things that should have knocked her flat, Evelyn Hart thought that maybe more to do was not the worst thing to have. The trouble came from the north, the way most trouble did in Wyoming. Pete brought the news on a Tuesday morning before the breakfast dishes were cleared, with the specific kind of quiet that Evelyn had learned to read as serious. He appeared in the study doorway and waited until she looked up, which she did immediately, because Pete did not appear in doorways without reason. "3 ranches hit overnight," he said. "Fowler's place, the Kendrick operation, and somebody's homestead claim about 8 miles east of Kendrick, cattle driven off. One of Fowler's hands got beaten up pretty bad when he tried to stop it." Evelyn set down her pen. "How many head?" "Fowler lost maybe 60. Kendrick's still counting." Pete leaned against the doorframe. "It's the Doyle outfit." She'd heard the name twice in the past 3 weeks, both times in passing. A gang operating along the northern territories that had been working its way south for the better part of a season, hitting smaller operations and disappearing back into the hill country before anyone could respond. She hadn't attached urgency to it because it had seemed distant, the kind of problem that happened to other people until it didn't. "Where's Colton?" she asked. "Already heard. He's in the yard." She found him with 4 of his senior hands, Pete, Cal, a veteran named Dutch, who had a scar across his chin and said very little, and a younger man named Garrett, who said too much but could ride better than anyone on the property. Colton was in the middle of a sentence when she arrived, and he finished it without pausing for her presence, which she appreciated. Doyle doesn't hit the same area twice in a week, Colton was saying. So Fowler and Kendrick are probably clear for now. But somebody north of us is next, and after that, he looked at the map he'd unrolled on the fence rail. If they follow the pattern they've been running, they'll push toward the valley operations within the month. Silvercrest's the biggest target in the valley, Dutch said. It wasn't a boast or a complaint, just an assessment. I know it. Colton traced the route on the map with one finger. I want 4 hands out on the northern fence line starting tonight. Rotating shifts, nobody alone. If they see anything they don't recognize, they come back instead of engaging. That's not going to stop them if they come in force, Garrett said. It's going to give us warning, Colton said, which is what we need. Evelyn looked at the map. The northern fence line of Silvercrest stretched nearly 11 miles. 4 hands on rotating shifts would cover it thinly, but it was better than nothing. The supply barn, she said. Colton looked at her. What about it? If they hit the outlying areas first and then come here, they're going to want the supply barn as much as the cattle. Feed, equipment, winter stores, it's the infrastructure. Burning or emptying the supply barn would cripple the operation even if they didn't take a single head. A brief silence. Dutch looked at her with the neutral expression of a man revising a prior judgment. She's right, Pete said. I know she's right, Colton said. He looked at the map for another moment, then at Evelyn. I want someone inventorying the supply barn and the storage cellars. Full list of what's there and what can't be replaced quickly. I'll have it done by tomorrow morning, she said. I also want the ranch records and the cash accounts moved somewhere they can't be easily located, he said. If this gets bad. There's a cellar under the original bunkhouse, Mrs. Crane said. Evelyn hadn't heard her arrive, but the woman appeared in these moments with the reliability of structural timber, solid and already in place. Nobody uses it anymore, dry, solid. That works, Colton said. He rolled the map and handed it to Dutch. Garrett, you and 2 take the first northern watch tonight. Dutch, get 4 more hands from the bunkhouse. Your pick, not whoever's available, whoever you trust. He paused. And somebody ride to Fowler's place. I want to know exactly what happened, not the third-hand version. The group dispersed. Evelyn went to the supply barn. She'd been in it before, of course. She'd reorganized the inventory system in week 3 and could name what was in every section from memory. But she went through it again now with a different eye, the eye she used when she was calculating not what things cost, but what they were worth when they could not be replaced. Winter feed stores, enough for 4 months. Equipment that would take 6 weeks to order from the nearest supply depot. Medicines for the livestock that she'd learned from Dutch were used in specific doses for specific conditions and could not be improvised. Rosa came and helped without being asked, which was its own kind of statement about where things stood. The list took most of the day. Fowler's hand came to Silvercrest that evening. Not a messenger, the man himself, still with a bruised eye and a split lip, he kept touching with careful fingers. His name was Sam Briggs, and he was perhaps 22, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee Mrs. Crane had given him and told the story twice, once in the disorganized way of someone still shaken, and once more clearly when Colton asked him to start from the beginning. The Doyle outfit had come in from the north side just after midnight. 8 men, maybe 10. It had been dark, and Sam hadn't been in a position to count carefully. They knew the layout of Fowler's operation, which meant either they'd scouted it beforehand or someone had told them. They cut the fence on the north pasture, drove the cattle out ahead of them, and were gone in under an hour. Sam had tried to rouse the bunkhouse and been caught in the yard by 2 of them. The beating had been efficient and impersonal, which struck Evelyn as somehow more unsettling than rage would have been. They said anything? Colton asked. Any of them? One of them. Sam touched his lip again. When they were finishing, he said, "Tell Ashford he's next." The kitchen went quiet. Even the fire seemed to hold still. He said it by name? Colton's voice was steady. Yes, sir. Tell Ashford he's next. Clear as I'm telling you. Evelyn looked at Colton. His face had gone into that controlled, flat expression, but there was something underneath it this time that she hadn't seen before. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. The recognition, perhaps, that a threat spoken by name was a different category of problem than a threat by proximity. You'll stay here tonight, Colton told Sam. Mrs. Crane will find you a bed. Tomorrow you can ride back to Fowler if you're up to it. After Sam was settled and the kitchen had emptied, Evelyn found Colton at the study window, his second position for difficult thinking, she'd established. The map was unrolled on the desk again with new marks on it that he'd made while she was finishing the supply inventory. "He knows your name," she said. "Doyle knows everybody's name," Colton said. "That's how he operates. He picks targets. He doesn't just hit whatever's in front of him." "Which means Silvercrest has been a target for some time." "Probably." He looked at the map. "What I don't know is whether he's planning a raid or something larger. A raid is cattle and supplies. Something larger is—" He stopped. "Take over," she said. "It's been done. Gang rolls into a territory, takes enough operations fast enough that the legitimate owners can't recover, establishes control of the grazing rights and the water." He said it with the flatness of someone who'd heard of it happening elsewhere and had now moved it into the category of immediate problems. "It's rare. But Doyle's been operating for 3 seasons without anyone stopping him." Evelyn looked at the map. Silvercrest sat at the center of the valley, which was its strength. Central location, water access, established routes to Harlan, and the rail connection beyond. It was also what made it the logical anchor point for anyone wanting to control the territory. "The neighboring ranches," she said. "Fowler, Kendrick, Douglas Crane's operation, how many hands total, across all of them?" Colton looked at her. "Why?" "Because 8 to 10 men can hit one ranch at a time," she said. "They can't hit coordinated operations simultaneously. If Fowler and Kendrick and Crane are watching their flanks while you're watching yours, the tactical advantage narrows considerably." He was quiet for a moment. "Crane won't like being organized by someone who lives on my property." "Crane doesn't have to like it," she said. "He has to see that it's in his interest." Another pause. "He came back last week," Colton said. "Mentioned you again." "Favorably or otherwise?" He said, the almost laugh, but muted. "He said you were the most inconvenient woman he'd met since his mother." "I'll take it," she said, which had become her response to Douglas Crane's assessments. Colton straightened from the map. "I'll ride to Crane's tomorrow. And Fowler, somebody needs to coordinate with Fowler, with Sam still shaken up." He paused. "I don't want to leave the ranch without a clear head on it." She looked at him. He was looking at the map, not at her, but the statement had a direction to it. "I'll manage the ranch," she said. "I know you will," he said, and she believed he meant it, which was not the same as it being uncomplicated. He left the next morning with Dutch and 2 other hands, taking the north road toward Crane's property, and then Fowler's. The plan was 2 days, possibly 3. He'd left Garrett nominally in charge of the physical operation, the watches, the hands, the cattle, and had said, quietly, on his way out, that Evelyn was to be consulted on anything that involved the ranch's resources or response to threat. Garrett had received this information with the expression of a young man choosing between his instinct and his better judgment, and his better judgment had, after a brief interval, won. The first day was manageable. The Northern Watch reported nothing unusual. The supply inventory was complete and secured. Evelyn moved the financial records and account books to the cellar under the old bunkhouse in 3 trips, with Rosa helping and Pete standing watch at the door, as if bandits were going to materialize out of the afternoon air. The second day was harder. A rider came in from the east at mid-morning, not one of their hands, a stranger, who pulled up at the gate and asked for Ashford. When told Ashford was away, he asked for whoever was in charge. Garrett walked out to meet him, and Evelyn, watching from the house, saw the exchange take 3 minutes before Garrett came back with a piece of paper and an expression she'd learned to read as "This is above my pay." The paper was a note from a rancher named Ellis Vance, whose operation was 7 miles northeast. Vance's cattle had been hit the previous night. 30 head gone. He was pulling his remaining hands back to his main buildings and wanted to know if Silvercrest was doing the same. "What do you want to do?" Garrett asked her, with the reluctant directness of a man who'd decided that asking was better than guessing. "Right back," she said. "Tell Vance that Silvercrest is maintaining its watch schedule and is not pulling back. Tell him he's welcome to coordinate with us." She paused. "And find out if he knows how many men they were." "He said 12, the rider offered. He was still at the gate, patient, waiting. 12. Up from 8 to 10 at Fowler's. Either the gang was expanding or they were consolidating for a larger push, and neither option was good. "Tell him 12, she said to Garrett. "Tell Colton's neighbors the number's gone up." Garrett nodded and went to write the reply. Evelyn looked at the map she'd pinned to the study wall, her own copy, made from Colton's that morning. She put a mark where Vance's ranch was and looked at the pattern. Fowler in the northwest, Kendrick slightly east of that, the homestead claim, and now Vance in the northeast. They were circling, or rather spiraling, tightening the geography. Silvercrest sat at the center of what that spiral was becoming. She went to find Pete. He was in the horse barn, doing something methodical with a bridle that he probably could have done in 30 seconds but was taking 10 minutes over, which she recognized as the way people held themselves together when they were waiting for bad news to arrive. "The pattern," she said. "Fowler to Kendrick to the homestead to Vance. What's between Vance and us?" Pete looked up. "Open range and the Morrison water claim. Morrison pulled up stakes 2 months ago, so there's nobody there." "So there's nothing between the Doyle gang and Silvercrest's northeast fence line?" "Not in terms of other ranches, no." He set the bridle down. There's the draw, though. Long cut draw. Runs east to west about 2 miles north of our fence. Any outfit moving cattle at night is going to have trouble driving them through the draw quietly, meaning they'd have to go around it. One way or the other, east end or west end. She looked at him. "Which end?" "West is closer to the road and easier going. East takes longer but puts them further from Harlan." He considered. "If I were moving stolen cattle at night and didn't want to be seen, I'd go east." "Where does that put them relative to our fence line?" "Coming in from the northeast corner, far end of our longest fence stretch." He paused. "Which is the stretch with the fewest hands on it, because it's furthest from the main buildings." She stood there for a moment, doing the geography in her head. "I want extra hands on the northeast corner tonight," she said. 4, not 2. We'd be pulling them from somewhere." "Pull them from the south. Nobody's hitting the south right now. They're working north to south, and they're not at our south line yet." Pete was quiet for a moment. He was doing his own calculations, and she let him do them, because Pete's calculations were the kind that came from knowing this specific land over years, which was something she didn't have and wasn't going to pretend to. "That's probably right," he said. "I'll move them after the evening feed." She went back to the main house and sat at the corner desk. Colton's study, which she'd been using in his absence with a kind of careful respect for the space that she didn't examine too closely, and looked at the map and the supply inventory, and the list of hands available, and the note from Vance, and she thought about 12 men moving at night and a ranch that was built to manage cattle, but not to defend itself against coordinated attack. She wrote 3 letters. One to Colton, detailing the developments since his departure, specific and unemotional. One to Douglas Crane directly, which she'd decided was her right regardless of what anyone thought of it, laying out the pattern and suggesting coordinated watch schedules between operations. One to Warren Pell in Harlan, asking what the territorial marshal situation was and whether there was any mechanism for requesting law enforcement response to organized rustling. She sent all 3 with riders before noon. Colton came back on the 3rd day, not the 2nd, and he came back with Crane riding alongside him, which was either a good sign or complicated, usually both with Douglas Crane. She met them in the yard. Colton looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "Vance's ranch was hit 2 nights ago," she said. 12 men. Pattern puts the next target at our northeast fence line. I moved 4 hands there last night." "Anything?" "No. But they weren't expecting movement last night. I think they're still working east of us." She looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane." "Miss Hart," he said, with the tone of a man whose position on her had not simplified but had been forced to accommodate new information. "She wrote me," Crane said to Colton. 12 is too many for one operation to handle if they hit in force." "I know it," Colton said. "I've got 14 hands I can spare," Crane said. "If you're willing to commit the same, and we get Fowler and Vance in on it." 45 men total, Colton said, across 4 properties. "Doyle's got 12 that Vance counted, maybe more in reserve. But we know this ground and they don't." Crane looked uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "The plan He stopped. "The coordinator. The coordination idea. Watching each other's flanks. It's sound." Evelyn did not say anything about this characterization. She thought it and did not say it, which was its own kind of discipline. "We need communication between properties," she said instead. "If one operation sees movement, the others need to know within the hour. Riders stationed at midpoints." That's 6 more men tied up in relay positions, Garrett said. He'd come out of the barn at some point. It's 6 men who mean the other 38 aren't fighting in the dark without information, she said. The cost is worth it. Crane looked at her with an expression that had lost most of its earlier quality of assessment and arrived somewhere closer to resignation. She does this often? He asked Colton. Consistently, Colton said. The coordination took the better part of 2 days to set up. Crane rode back to his operation and sent his foreman to work with Pete on the midpoint relay positions. A message went out to Fowler, who was managing without Sam, still recovering, and to Vance, who responded with the relief of a man who'd been watching a horizon alone for too long. Evelyn managed the communication, because she was managing everything that involved paper and coordination, and because nobody else had a clear enough picture of all 4 operations simultaneously to draft the relay schedules without error. She worked at the desk until midnight for 2 nights running and was up before dawn both mornings. And Mrs. Crane brought coffee without comment, and Rosa brought bread without being asked. And Pete stood in the doorway twice just to see if she needed anything, and then left when she said she didn't. She was not entirely sure when the ranch had decided to take care of her back, but she'd noticed it somewhere in the second night and found it unexpectedly hard to put away. The Doyle outfit came on a Thursday night, 4 days after Colton's return. They came from the northeast, as Pete had said they would, moving through the gap left by the Morrison claim, pushing toward the far end of the fence line. What they didn't know, because they hadn't been watching Silvercrest long enough to see the adjustment, was that the northeast corner now had 4 men on it instead of 2, and that one of those men was Dutch, who had spent 20 years in this territory and could hear cattle moving at a distance that impressed even Pete. Evelyn was in the main house when the first relay rider came in. She'd told herself she would sleep, but she'd been at the desk instead, going through the pre-1881 records that Pell had asked about, looking for the signing correspondence on the banknote. He was already at the door when he came up the steps. "Northeast fence," he said, breathing hard. "Dutch says 10 men minimum, moving toward the far pasture. They're maybe 20 minutes out." She had the household awake in 4 minutes. Garrett was already heading for the bunkhouse when she came out of the main house. Colton came from the back of the property, where he'd been doing his own check of the south fence, and she caught him in the yard and delivered the information in 11 words. "Northeast fence, 10 men, 20 minutes, Dutch is watching." "Get everyone inside the main buildings," he said. "Anyone not on the fence line or riding out, inside." "Rosa and the kitchen staff are all ready." "I know you handled it," he said, and he was moving toward his horse, and there wasn't time for anything beyond that. She went back inside. Mrs. Crane had the household staff in the main room, 7 people, practical and scared, and she was managing them with the authority of a woman who'd lived through bad nights before and intended to live through this one too. "Is there a rifle in the house?" Evelyn asked her. Mrs. Crane looked at her steadily. "There are 2, cabinet in the hallway." "Can anyone here use them?" "I can," said Rosa from the corner, which surprised nobody who'd paid attention. Evelyn got the rifles from the cabinet and checked them with the mechanical familiarity of someone who'd grown up in a household where her father had believed women should know how to manage firearms, one of the few positions of his that had aged well. She handed one to Rosa and kept the other. "We're not going out," she said clearly to the room. "We're staying in and we're staying quiet. But if someone comes through that door who isn't one of ours, we are not going to stand there and wait to find out what they want." The room was very still. Someone, she thought it was the youngest of the kitchen girls, barely 16, exhaled a shaky breath, and Rosa moved to stand next to her without fanfare, which was the right thing to do. The next 40 minutes were among the longest of Evelyn's life. She heard shooting, distant enough to be north of the main buildings, which meant the fence line. 2 short bursts and then a longer exchange and then silence, which was the kind of silence that told you nothing and asked you to hold still anyway. Mrs. Crane sat down, which was the first time Evelyn had ever seen her sit down when there was any work to be done, and she sat with her hands flat on her knees and her face doing something complicated underneath its usual composure. The relay rider came back in 30 minutes. He knocked this time, which was the signal Evelyn had established. 3 knocks, pause. 2. Before she opened the door. "They're on the run," he said. Dutch and Garrett pushed them back at the fence. Colton and the others caught them trying to circle west. He was slightly out of breath and trying not to show it. "Some of them got away." 3 of ours are down, but none of them dead." She let the breath out. Behind her in the main room, she heard Mrs. Crane make a sound that was not quite relief, but was in the same territory. "Who's down?" she asked. He named them. One of the younger hands, whose last name she'd only recently learned. Cal, who had a cut on his arm that sounded serious but manageable. And Colton. She kept her voice level. "How bad?" "Arm in his side. They're bringing him in. He's conscious." She turned to Rosa. "Get water boiling. Get the clean linens from the cedar chest." She turned back to the rider. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. She prepared what she could prepare in 15 minutes, which was odd enough but was better than nothing. And she thought about the pre-1881 records still open on the desk, and the banknote, and Silas Greer, and all the patient, ordinary work that would still be there when this night was finished. And she thought that this was the thing about a place you'd started to consider yours. The work didn't stop mattering just because something else was also mattering very loudly. Colton came in on his own feet, which was the first thing she saw, and she did not let herself feel the extent of her relief at that, because there were more immediate things to do. He'd been cut along his left forearm, deep but not to the bone, and had taken what looked like a glancing impact on his right side, either a bullet that had grazed or a blow from something. He was pale under his tan, and his jaw was set in the way she recognized as managing pain rather than feeling nothing. "Sit," she said. Sit," she said again. He sat. Mrs. Crane appeared with the boiling water. Rosa had the linens. Evelyn cleaned the arm wound with the systematic efficiency of someone who didn't have the luxury of being squeamish. And Colton watched her work without saying anything for the first minute, and then said, "The northeast fence." 4 men, she said. "Pete adjusted 3 nights ago." A pause. "Dutch said they walked right into the watch." Pete figured the approach vector from the draw. She cleaned the last of the wound and pressed a folded cloth against it. "Hold this." He held it. "The house?" "Fine. Everyone inside, nobody hurt." He exhaled. Not quite the same sound as relief, but the structural equivalent. His eyes tracked to Rosa, who was cleaning up, and to Mrs. Crane, who was already reorganizing, and back to Evelyn. "You managed the whole... There's a relay protocol that needs to be reviewed in the morning," she said. The east midpoint position took too long to get word back. The timing was off by nearly 5 minutes. That's fixable. She checked the cloth over the wound and pressed firmer. "And I'd want Pete to look at the northeast corner fencing tomorrow. If they came in once, the fence is compromised." "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He almost never used her first name. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no qualification. His eyes were direct and tired, and something else she wasn't going to name at this specific moment. "The relay timing," she said, because it was easier to talk about that. 5 minutes isn't acceptable when men are in the field." "I know," he said. "We'll fix it in the morning." He sat there with the cloth against his arm, and the lamplight doing what lamplight does to a face that's had a hard night. And she thought about the man on the road who'd ridden out of the trees and asked if she always told road agents no. And she thought that 10 weeks was not very long to know a person, and was also, somehow, long enough. She didn't say that. She finished the dressing and told him to stay still, and went to the desk to close the pre-1881 ledger before she forgot. And outside the Wyoming dark was doing what Wyoming dark did, sitting on everything, indifferent and enormous and waiting for morning. 3 of their men were being looked after in the bunkhouse. The fence had a hole in it. The Doyle outfit had scattered into the hill country with fewer men than they'd arrived with, which was not the same as finished. But Silvercrest stood. The cattle were in the south pasture, untouched. The records were in the cellar under the old bunkhouse. The supply barn was locked and whole. She closed the ledger and looked at the map on the wall with its marks and relay routes and the notation she'd made in the corner, northeast draw, primary approach vector. She'd written that 4 days ago, on an educated guess informed by Pete's knowledge and her own habit of following logic wherever it went. She was not going to feel satisfied about it. Satisfaction was for when the whole job was done and the whole job was not done. But she was going to let herself feel, for precisely as long as it took to walk from the desk to the doorway and back, that she had been useful tonight in a way that mattered. Not because anyone had told her so, but because the house was standing and the people in it were still breathing, and sometimes that was the only measure that counted. Then she went to check on Cal's arm. Cal's arm healed cleaner than expected, which Pete said was because Cal had the constitution of a man who refused to inconvenience anyone, including his own body. The younger hand, the one whose last name Evelyn had only recently learned, a 19-year-old from Nebraska named Thomas Reeve, had taken a blow to his shoulder that would keep him out of heavy work for 3 weeks. Colton's side turned out to be a cracked rib rather than anything worse, which he discovered on the second day when the initial numbness wore off and breathing became a project requiring conscious effort. He did not slow down appreciably. This irritated Evelyn in a way she didn't examine at length. "You cracked a rib," she said, on the third morning when she found him moving supply crates in the barn. "I know what I did," he said. "Then you know that moving heavy objects is exactly the wrong approach to letting it heal." "It's not that heavy." She looked at the crate. It was demonstrably heavy. "Colton." He set it down, not because she'd told him to, but because his expression made clear that his body had just made the same argument she had, and he'd found it harder to ignore from that direction. He straightened slowly and breathed in a controlled way that she recognized as pain management. "Dutch can move the crates," she said. "Dutch is at the northeast fence." "Then Pete is coordinating the relay review you asked for." She held his gaze. He held hers back. It was the particular standoff of two people who were each accustomed to being the most stubborn person in a given room and had not yet fully negotiated what happened when they occupied the same one. "Sit," she said. "You said that the other night, too." "It worked the other night." Something moved in his expression, the almost laugh, weaker than usual because of the rib, but present. He sat on the edge of a hay bale, with the controlled care of a man who would not let the cost of sitting show on his face, but couldn't entirely hide it from someone who'd been watching his face for 10 weeks. "The relay timing," she said, because she'd promised herself she'd raise it in the morning, and it was now the third morning. "I went back through the sequence. The East Midpoint rider lost 4 minutes because he didn't have a clear protocol for what counted as a reportable movement versus routine animal noise. We need a threshold." "What kind of threshold?" "Specific. Not if you see something suspicious. Something you can apply in the dark in 45 seconds. I wrote a draft." She handed him the page she'd been carrying in her coat pocket because she'd known she'd find him somewhere she hadn't planned to be having this conversation. He read it. His face went through the careful consideration he gave to things that mattered. "This is good," he said. "Show it to Dutch when he's back." "I will." She paused. "How's the rib?" "Fine." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." He handed the page back. "The Doyle outfit. Garrett and 2 of Crane's men followed their trail north yesterday. They've pulled back past the Morrison claim, at least for now." "For now," she said. "For now," he agreed. "Doyle doesn't give up territory. He regroups." He looked at the barn wall, which seemed to be his equivalent of what she did with maps. "We bought time, that's all." "Time is enough if we use it," she said. He looked at her then. "You always talk about time like it's a material, something you inventory. Isn't it? Most people talk about it like weather, something that happens to you." She thought about that. "My father used to say that the difference between people who solved problems and people who were solved by them was whether they treated time as a resource or a condition." "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Colton said. "He was," she said, and meant it, and the 2 words sat between them without requiring elaboration. She left him in the barn. He did not move any more crates, she noted, checking once from the doorway before she went back to the house, and went to the desk and opened the pre-1881 records, which she'd barely touched since the night of the raid. The correspondence on the banknote signing was in the 4th box she opened. It had been misfiled under a general heading of Territorial Correspondence 1879 to a 1780, which was either an accident or not, and she sat with it for a long time, reading through the exchange between Colton's father and the bank, and then between Colton himself and Greer in the transition period after his father's death. The signing meeting had no written record, no confirmation letter, no summary, no witness list, which meant either it had been intentionally conducted without documentation, unusual for a transaction of that size, or any documentation had been removed. She wrote this down in precise language and added it to the folder for Warren Pell. The harvest celebration in Harlan was an annual event that Evelyn had heard mentioned in passing since her second week at Silvercrest, in the way that recurring community events get mentioned, assumed as background, already known to everyone who needed to know it. It was only when Mrs. Crane raised it directly in the fourth week after the raid that it became something requiring her attention. "It's the largest gathering in the territory outside of the rail days," Mrs. Crane said. She was inventorying the linen closet while she talked, which was how she handled conversations she considered potentially awkward. Keep her hands busy and her eyes on the work. "Ranch owners, bankers, the judge from Cheyenne if he makes the trip, families." She folded a pillowcase. "Mr. Ashford goes every year, usually takes some of the senior hands." "I see," Evelyn said. "It's a significant occasion," Mrs. Crane said. Fold. "People notice who attends and in what capacity." Evelyn understood what was being communicated. "You're telling me it matters whether I go." "I'm telling you it matters how you're presented if you do." Mrs. Crane set the pillowcase down and looked at her directly, which meant the conversation had reached its actual point. "There's been talk since before the raid. The raid hasn't stopped it. If anything, the fact that you managed the ranch while Mr. Ashford was away has given the talk more material to work with." "What kind of material?" Mrs. Crane's expression managed to convey, without saying anything uncharitable, that some of the material was about Evelyn's motives, and some of it was about Colton's judgment, and some of it was about the general unseemly nature of a woman occupying the position she occupied in a household where she was neither family nor clearly subordinate. "I see," Evelyn said again. "You don't seem concerned," Mrs. Crane said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "I'm not concerned," Evelyn said. "I've been aware of the talk since week 3. I decided then that I wasn't going to adjust my work to manage other people's interpretation of it." She paused. "That said, I understand the harvest celebration is different. Public, formal, attended by people whose opinions affect the ranch's relationships." "Yes," Mrs. Crane said. "Is there something specific you think I should do, or are you raising it so I'm aware?" Mrs. Crane was quiet for a moment. She picked up another pillowcase, then set it back down. "You've done more for this ranch in 12 weeks than most people do in a year," she said, with the deliberate care of a woman not accustomed to saying things like that directly. I'd rather the people at that celebration see the truth of it than the version that's been circulating in town." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Crane." "Margaret," she said. "My name is Margaret. You've been here 3 months and you've been calling me Mrs. Crane as if I'm your employer." "Aren't you?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "Mr. Ashford is your employer. She seemed to locate the right word with some effort. "I'm the person who brought you coffee at midnight when you were working on those relay schedules." Evelyn thought about that for a moment and felt something she'd been keeping at a careful arm's length for 12 weeks settle a little closer to her chest without permission. "Margaret," she said. "All right." Margaret picked this pillowcase back up. "The celebration is in 3 weeks. You'll want something to wear that isn't your work dress." She told Colton about the banknote correspondence, or rather, the absence of it, on a Thursday, 10 days after the raid, when his rib had healed enough that he could sit at the desk for more than 20 minutes without his jaw doing the pain management thing. He read her summary carefully, as always, and was quiet at the end of it. "No record of the signing," he said, "none that I can find. And I've been through every box in the storage room that predates 1882. "My father handled that meeting," Colton said. "He was thorough with paperwork. There should be something." "That's what I thought," she said. He set the summary down and looked at it without looking at it, the way he looked at things when he was working through implications rather than details. "Greer was present at my father's last 2 years of business," he said. "When my father got sick, Greer handled several transactions on his behalf. Had authority to—" He stopped. "Had authority to manage correspondence?" "Some of it. During the bad period when my father couldn't manage the ranch himself." His voice was even, but the particular evenness of something being held. "I was 28. I'd been running the cattle operations, but my father kept the financial relationships. I inherited them when he died and trusted that they were—" He stopped again. "That they were what they appeared to be," she said. "Yes." She understood what she was looking at, not just fraud, but the specific kind that required patience and proximity and the willingness to wait until someone was too grieved and too busy to examine the ground they were standing on. She'd named this to Colton weeks ago in a different context, and she saw him recognize it now in his own history. "Greer had access to your father's correspondence files during those 2 years," she said. If there was a signing record, it might not have been removed after the fact. It might never have been filed in the first place. No record means no proof the terms were misrepresented at signing, Colton said. It also means no proof they weren't. She met his eyes. Pell thinks the disclosure argument is viable even without the signing record, because the burden shifts. If Greer can't demonstrate proper disclosure, the clause is challengeable on those grounds alone. He was quiet for a moment. $340 over 3 years, he said, and she understood he wasn't thinking about the money specifically, but about what the money represented. The accumulated small takings of a relationship he'd inherited from his father and trusted without adequate examination. "I'm sorry," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say, and because she meant it. He looked at her. "You don't have to keep apologizing for things other people did." "I'm not apologizing for them," she said. "I'm expressing—" She paused, looking for the word. "Regret that it happened. Those are different things." He held her gaze for a moment. There were things in the way he looked at her that she'd been cataloging in the same careful way she cataloged everything. Specific, dated, noted, without full interpretation. She did not interpret them now. "The celebration in Harlan," he said. She blinked slightly at the shift. "Margaret mentioned it." "I'd like you to come," he said. Not as... He stopped, as if the sentence had started in a direction he hadn't fully committed to. "Not in any formal capacity. As someone who's been part of this ranch for 3 months and deserves to be seen as such." "I understand," she said carefully. "Do you?" It wasn't quite a question, more like an assessment of whether the understanding she'd expressed was the one he'd intended. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. The clock on the mantel ticked through a silence that had the quality of the silences they'd developed on the road back from Pell's office. Not empty, but full of things they were both choosing to leave in place for now. "I'll come," she said. The 3 weeks before the celebration were, in some ways, the most complicated of her time at Silvercrest, though they contained no raids and no fraud discoveries and no confrontations in bank offices. The complication was subtler, the ordinary kind, which she'd always found harder to navigate than the dramatic kind precisely because there was nothing specific to address. Douglas Crane came to the ranch twice. The first visit was straightforwardly about the Doyle situation, a conversation between him and Colton and Pete about the winter patrol schedule and the territorial marshal's response to the formal complaint they'd filed. The marshal had sent a deputy who had ridden through the area with the air of a man fulfilling a requirement and had written a report that Evelyn judged as thorough without being useful. The second visit was nominally about the rail contract renewal, which was genuinely a topic requiring discussion, but Crane arrived an hour earlier than expected and spent 20 minutes in the main room before Colton came in from the north pasture, during which time Evelyn was working at the desk and Crane was in the adjacent room, and the silence between them had a peculiar quality of two people deciding whether to have a conversation. Crane came to the study doorway. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Crane," she said without looking up from the rail contract draft she'd been reviewing. "The raid," he said. "The northeast fence situation. That was your call." "Pete's analysis of the draw approach. I acted on it." "But you made the decision." "Colton had authorized me to make decisions regarding the ranch's resources," she said. "It was within that authority." Crane was quiet for a moment. She looked up. I was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands in a way she hadn't seen before, a posture that said something was costing him something. "I came here in September," he said, "and told Colton he was making a mistake keeping you on." "I know," she said. "I said it to his face and I said it around town. Both." He looked at her. "That's going to be present at the celebration, the people who heard me say it." "I know that too," she said. "I'm telling you because—" He stopped, rubbed the brim of his hat with one thumb. "Because I said it and I was wrong, and I'd rather you heard that from me directly than have it standing between us without acknowledgement." Evelyn looked at Douglas Crane, this large, difficult, protective man who had been wrong about her in the particular way that people were wrong about competence they hadn't expected, and she thought that the acknowledgement itself cost him something real, and that was worth something. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it directly." He nodded once. The hat went back onto his head. "I still think you're the most inconvenient woman I've encountered since my mother," he said. "I'll take it," she said. made a sound that was, unexpectedly, an actual laugh, brief and genuine and a little surprised at itself. Then he went to wait for Colton, and Evelyn went back to the rail contract, and something shifted in the room that didn't have a name but didn't need one. The dress question was resolved by Margaret, who appeared one morning with a folded item of deep blue wool and the expression of a woman who had thought this through and was not interested in debate. "It was mine," she said, "before I was your size. It'll need the waist taken in and the hem let out." Evelyn looked at the dress. It was good quality, not fashionable by any current Eastern standard, but well made and well kept, the kind of garment that communicated seriousness rather than display. "Margaret, don't argue," Margaret said. "You haven't got anything suitable, and the celebration is in 6 days, and there isn't time to order from Cheyenne." Evelyn did not argue. She had the dress altered by Rosa, who turned out to have a seamstress background she hadn't mentioned, and tried it on the evening before the celebration, and stood in the narrow mirror in her room off the kitchen and thought about Pittsburgh and her father's house, and the woman she'd been when she left it, and the woman she'd apparently become somewhere along 11 miles of Wyoming road. Not a different woman, the same one, just settled into something, like a house that's been through a winter and found its foundation. She went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, which was fine. She hadn't expected to. The harvest celebration in Harlan occupied the main street and the fairground behind the church hall, and seemed to involve the entire population of the surrounding territory simultaneously. Evelyn arrived in the Silvercrest wagon with Colton and Margaret and Garrett, who had cleaned up to a standard that surprised everyone, including himself. And she stepped out into the noise and movement and the particular smell of a community event, food and livestock and wood smoke and people who didn't see each other often enough, and adjusted to it. She was aware immediately of being noticed, not the way she'd been noticed in Harlan that first day at the bank, with cautious assessment. This was different. People looked at her and then at Colton and then at each other, and the information traveled in the quick, complex way that information travels in small communities where everyone has been talking about the same thing for weeks. She met it with the same approach she'd used for everything else, directly, without performing either defiance or deference. Silas Greer was there. She saw him across the fairground 20 minutes in, talking to a group of men she recognized as local business owners. He saw her at approximately the same moment, and the instant of calculation on his face was brief but visible to someone who'd been watching his face for information since their first meeting. She did not go to him. She noted his position and went in the other direction, toward the group she'd spotted that included Warren Pell and a man she didn't recognize who Colton later identified as the Cheyenne judge. Pell greeted Colton and then her with the same handshake, which she took as deliberate. "Miss Hart," he said, "I've been reviewing the materials you sent. I think we have a viable challenge." "Good," she said. "What's the timeline?" "Ideally before the winter sessions. That gives us," he calculated, 6 weeks. "I can have everything ready in 3, she said. The judge, a quiet man named Hargrove, who said very little and appeared to be listening to everything, glanced at her. She met the glance without apology. The afternoon moved through its stages. There was food, competitive events she watched from the edge, conversations that wove around the fairground with the logic of a long-established community doing the annual work of catching up. Douglas Crane found her near the food tables with his wife, Eleanor, who was small and direct, and shook Evelyn's hand with the grip of someone who'd formed her own opinion independently. "Douglas told me about the fence," Eleanor Crane said. "The northeast approach. Your analysis." "Pete's knowledge of the terrain," Evelyn said. "I connected some points." "That's modesty," Eleanor said, without judgment in either direction. "Douglas doesn't do modesty, and I've learned to identify it in others." Evelyn looked at Douglas Crane, who had the expression of a man whose wife was saying something accurate and slightly uncomfortable. "He's been generous enough to acknowledge that he was wrong about me," Evelyn said. "He's been wrong about women before," Eleanor said pleasantly. "He's usually eventually honest about it. Eventually." She patted her husband's arm in a way that conveyed 30 years of settled partnership. "Come find me later," she told Evelyn. "I want to hear about the account work. Douglas gave me an outline, but he's not good with financial specifics." "I'd like that," Evelyn said, and meant it. Colton found her near the end of the afternoon, when the light was going gold and the event was beginning its gradual wind-down. He'd been moving through the celebration in the way he moved through everything, steady, present, not performing his own importance. and he'd been in and out of her field of vision all day in the specific way of someone who isn't following you but is aware of where you are. "Greer left an hour ago," he said, falling into step beside her. "I noticed. Pell says the challenge has a real chance." "I know. I was there." He glanced at her, and she caught the almost laugh before he suppressed it. They walked toward the edge of the fairground where it was quieter, and she thought they were probably both tired in the way of people who'd been performing a version of themselves in public all day, and were ready to stop. "People have been asking about you," he said, "what your role is, what you're planning to do." "What have you told them?" "The truth," he said, "that you manage the ranch finances and household operations, that Silvercrest is a better operation because of it." "And what have they said?" "Various things." He paused. "Mostly they've decided to form their opinion based on what they saw today rather than what they heard before." She considered that. "Is that enough?" "It's a start," he said, "which is generally how things begin." They reached the edge of the fairground, where the grass gave way to open ground, and the noise of the crowd was behind them. The last of the afternoon light sat on the hills west of town in a way she'd been noting for months. The specific quality of Wyoming light in autumn, which had a different weight than any light she'd known before. "I want to ask you something," Colton said, and something in the way he said it was different from the way he said most things. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills, not her, and his hands were in his coat pockets, and his posture had the quality of a man who was doing something that didn't come naturally to him and had decided to do it anyway. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know I know that. I've been aware of it for several weeks now, possibly since the road." "Since the road," she said. She kept her voice steady. "You told a road agent no, and then you told me you'd never ridden a horse." He glanced at her briefly. I thought you were either the most stubborn person I'd ever met or the bravest." "Both are possible," she said. "Both are true," he said. "I've established that." He turned toward her then, fully, and she saw on his face the same expression she'd been cataloging for 11 weeks, the one she hadn't fully interpreted. "I'd like to court you," he said, "properly, with your consent and in full view of anyone who wants to have an opinion about it, which they will, and I'm not interested in managing their opinion. I'm asking yours." She held his gaze. There were things she could say, practical things, about what it meant for her position at the ranch, about the difference between what she'd come here for and what she'd found, about the particular risk of feeling things for a person whose household you managed, and whose finances you'd reorganized and whose rib you'd watched him pretend didn't hurt. She said none of them. "You're not doing this because of the raid," she said, "or the banknote, or the relay schedules." "No," he said. "I'm doing it because for 11 weeks you've been the most—" He stopped. "Started differently. Because I'd rather have this conversation now than in another month when I've found 12 more practical reasons to delay it." She thought about that. She thought about a woman on a train platform in Pittsburgh with $31 and a fraudulent letter. And she thought about the road and the bandits and the study with the catastrophic paperwork. And she thought that life had a way of arriving at its actual destination by a route you wouldn't have chosen on a map. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Yes, you may court me," she said, "properly and in full view of anyone who wants to form an opinion, which they will." The almost laugh came fully this time, real, unguarded, the kind that changed his whole face, and she thought she'd file that one differently from the others. Not for later. For now. Behind them, the harvest celebration continued its settling toward evening. Somewhere in the crowd, Douglas Crane was probably saying something to Eleanor about inconvenient women, and Eleanor was probably agreeing with the wrong part of it on purpose, and Warren Pell was probably thinking about banknote disclosure provisions, and Margaret was almost certainly watching the direction Evelyn and Colton had walked with the expression of a woman who had known before either of them did. The hills held the last of the light. Evelyn stood in it and did not try to inventory it or calculate it or determine what it was worth. She just let it be what it was. The Pell meeting happened on a Monday, 6 days after the harvest celebration, in an office that smelled of old paper and wood polish and the particular concentration of a man who'd spent 40 years thinking carefully before he spoke. Evelyn had prepared everything in the 3 weeks she'd promised, organized not just the documents, but the argument itself. laid out in sequence with the specific detail that turned a general grievance into a legal position. She'd worked with the methodical patience she brought to every problem that mattered, and she'd been aware, somewhere underneath the work, that this particular problem mattered in ways beyond the money. It was about what Silas Greer had counted on when he'd buried that clause. Counted on a young man too grieved and too busy to look carefully, too trusting of a relationship inherited from his father to examine it for rot. She had a feeling about that kind of calculation. A personal one. Warren Pell read through the assembled documents with his glasses sliding down his nose at regular intervals, pushing them back with the same absent gesture each time. And when he finished, he set everything down and looked at the two of them across the desk. "This is the most complete case file I've received from a non-lawyer," he said. He said it to Evelyn specifically, and this time there was no trace of the corrected surprise she'd heard in September. "I've had practice organizing evidence," she said. "The pre-1881 correspondence gap is your strongest point," Pell said. "Greer cannot produce a signing record because there isn't one, and the absence favors you. The burden of demonstrating proper disclosure falls to the party asserting the clause's validity." He tapped the folder. "The rate adjustment history I can build into a secondary argument. Even if the clause were deemed properly included, the adjustment pattern is inconsistent with the regulatory basis Greer cited." "He cited a regulation that had a narrow window," Evelyn said. "The adjustment was made 14 months after that window closed." Pell looked at her. "Yes, exactly." He cleared his throat in the way of a man who wanted to say something and was locating the right form for it. "Where did you learn to read financial instruments?" "My father's business," she said, "and necessity." "Necessity is underrated as a teacher," Pell said. He looked at Colton. "I'd like to file with the territorial court before the winter session closes. That's 4 weeks. I'll need 2 more meetings with Miss Hart to finalize the argument, and I'll need you present for the affidavit on the signing meeting." "You'll have both," Colton said. Pell nodded and began gathering papers. Then he stopped. "Greer will fight this," he said. "He has relationships in this territory that go back 30 years. He'll call in favors. There may be pressure. On you, on people associated with you." "I'm familiar with the approach," Evelyn said. Pell looked at her over his glasses. "I imagine you are." On the ride back to Silvercrest, she rode properly now, not expertly, but without the white-knuckled uncertainty of that first autumn ride, which she counted as one of the smaller victories of the past months. Colton was quiet for the first mile in the way that meant he was thinking rather than withdrawing. "Greer will go to Douglas first," he said. "Crane's the most prominent rancher in the valley aside from me. If he can persuade Crane that this challenge is destabilizing—" "Douglas won't be persuaded," Evelyn said. "Not by Greer." Colton looked at her. "You're certain of that?" "He came to me," she said, "before the celebration. He acknowledged he was wrong." She paused. "A man like Douglas Crane doesn't do that unless he's already made a commitment to a different position." Colton was quiet for another half-mile. "You read people the way you read account books. The principles are similar," she said. "You look for what's consistent and what isn't, what matches the stated purpose and what doesn't." "And what do you read in me?" he asked. He said it without looking at her, watching the road, and she understood that the lightness in his voice was covering something genuine. She considered the honest answer, which was the only kind she gave. "Someone who makes decisions slowly and keeps them," she said, "who extends trust once and withdraws it cleanly when it's violated, who is more comfortable with hard work than with being managed, and who is learning to be uncomfortable with that last part when the circumstances require it." He said nothing for a moment. "That last part." "Being managed occasionally," she said, "by someone whose judgment you trust. Is that what you'd call it?" "That's the most accurate word for it," she said. "You can use a different one if you prefer." The almost laugh, full now, unguarded the way it had been at the fairground. "I'll use yours," he said. Greer moved in the second week as Pell had predicted. He didn't come to Silvercrest directly. That would have been too visible. He worked through the network of relationships he'd built over 30 years, which was what 30 years of careful positioning was for. A story began circulating in Harlan, specific enough to be damaging, that the challenge to the banknote was being driven not by legitimate legal grievance, but by an outside woman who had inserted herself into Silvercrest's affairs and was now pursuing a personal vendetta against one of the territory's most trusted financial figures. Evelyn heard the story from Eleanor Crane, who rode out to Silvercrest specifically to deliver it, not with alarm, but with the directness of a woman who believed in arming people with accurate information. "It's in 2 of the business circles already," Eleanor said. They were sitting in the kitchen with coffee, which had become where Eleanor Crane chose to have conversations she considered real, as opposed to the formal sitting room where she had conversations she considered necessary. "Greer's version has you as ambitious at best and something worse at worst. He's careful with his language. Doesn't say anything directly actionable." "He never does," Evelyn said. "No." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "How are you?" The question surprised her, which showed because Eleanor's expression shifted slightly into something warmer. "I'm managing," Evelyn said, which was accurate but incomplete. "The story bothers you less than you expected," Eleanor said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've had versions of it before," Evelyn said. "Pittsburgh, the placement agency." "People find it easier to explain a woman's actions as self-serving than as competent." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "What bothers me is that it might affect the legal challenge. Pell's argument is sound, but if the territorial judge has been primed to see me as the driving force rather than the actual facts." "That's what Douglas is handling," Eleanor said. Evelyn looked at her. "I didn't ask him to." "No," Eleanor said. "He decided." She set her cup down. "Douglas doesn't do things he hasn't decided to do. You should know that by now." A pause. "He's spoken to 3 of the other Valley ranchers already, and he had a conversation with Judge Hargrove that I was not present for, but that Douglas described afterward as productive." "What did he say to Hargrove?" "That Greer's narrative was precisely that. A narrative constructed to deflect from a factual legal question. That the documentation speaks for itself. And that any judge who let Silas Greer's social positioning substitute for legal argument might find the territory's ranching community had a different view of the court by spring." Evelyn absorbed that. Douglas Crane essentially told a territorial judge to do his job. Douglas Crane essentially told a territorial judge to do his job. Eleanor confirmed, with the composure of a woman who had spent 30 years watching her husband do exactly this and had made her peace with it. "I don't know whether to thank him or be alarmed," Evelyn said. "Both," Eleanor said. "That's usually the right response to Douglas." The Doyle situation resolved in the 3rd week after the celebration, which was unexpected and came from a direction nobody had anticipated. A deputy from the Territorial Marshal's office, a different one from the first, this one younger, and with the look of someone who actually intended to do the job, arrived at Silvercrest with news that the Doyle outfit had been broken up 200 miles north by a combination of a large ranching coalition and, less expectedly, by Doyle's own men turning on each other over the division of a major cattle theft. 3 of the gang were in custody. Doyle himself had fled south but was being tracked. "We don't think he'll come back to this territory," the deputy said. "He's lost too many men and the coordinated response here." He looked at his notes. "The relay system and the multi-ranch watch coordination. That's apparently what held him off your operation long enough for the northern ranchers to catch up." Colton listened to this with the expression of a man receiving good news carefully, because good news on the frontier had a way of having conditions attached. "You're confident he's finished here?" "Confident as I can be," the deputy said. "We'll maintain a patrol through winter." After the deputy left, Pete appeared in the barn doorway. He'd been listening, because Pete was always somewhere listening when it mattered, and he and Colton looked at each other with the specific silence of men who'd been through something together and were registering that it was over. "The northeast fence?" Pete said. "Get it fully repaired before snow," Colton said. "Proper post this time, not the field repair from October." "Already ordered the materials," Pete said. He glanced at Evelyn, who was standing to the side. "The relay protocol," he said to her directly. "The revised version. We keeping it over winter?" "We keep it over winter," she said. "The Doyle situation is resolved. The general principle isn't." Pete nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of approval, minimal, genuine, requiring no elaboration. "Good call," he said, and went back to the barn. The court session happened in November, on a Thursday that had the cold quality of Wyoming autumn fully arrived. Not yet the deep freeze of winter, but a serious rehearsal for it. Evelyn sat beside Warren Pell at the plaintiff's table and arranged her documents in the order she'd prepared them, and looked at the territorial courtroom, which was a converted meeting hall that smelled of pine and old wool coats and the particular anxious energy of legal proceedings. Silas Greer was across the room with his own lawyer, a man from Cheyenne named Aldred, who had the practiced ease of someone who'd won through social architecture before and intended to do it again. Greer had the composure of a man who'd managed 30 years of complex relationships and considered this one more challenge to that management. He looked at Evelyn once when the room was settling. She looked back. She didn't look away first, and neither did he. And then Judge Hargrove came in, and the room stood, and the thing began. It took 4 hours. Pell was methodical and specific in the way she'd known he would be. This was his strength, and she'd organized the case around it rather than around argument, because argument could be countered, and specific documentation was harder to dismiss. The absence of the signing correspondence was the first element. The rate adjustment timing relative to the regulatory window was the second. The adjustment pattern over 3 years, consistent, recurring, always just below the threshold that would have triggered a routine audit, was the third. Aldred objected 3 times. Hargrove sustained 1 and overruled 2. When Aldred put Greer on the stand, Greer spoke with the credibility of someone who'd been building it for 30 years. And Evelyn listened to every word with the specific attention she gave to things that needed to be understood rather than just heard. He was good. She acknowledged that privately. The language he used was precise in its imprecision, never lying directly, always positioning. Then Pell cross-examined, and he asked Greer to produce the signing meeting record. Greer said there had been an informal meeting, undocumented in the usual way for transactions of trust between established parties. Pell asked what the regulatory basis was for the 1882 rate adjustment. Greer cited the same regulation he'd cited to Evelyn in his office, and Pell produced the Territorial Banking Commission record showing the regulation's effective window had closed 14 months prior. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that precedes a shift. Hargrove asked Greer directly whether he could produce any documentation of the regulatory basis for the adjustment at the time it was made. Greer's lawyer objected. Hargrove overruled him with the expression of a man who had been told to do his job and had taken the advice. Greer said he would need time to locate the documentation. Hargrove said he had 20 minutes. The documentation did not materialize in 20 minutes because it did not exist, and everyone in the room understood that by the time the 20 minutes had passed. Hargrove ruled in Silvercrest's favor on the disclosure argument. The clause was deemed improperly applied. The overpayment of $342 was to be returned with interest. He also made a note, a formal, recorded note, that the Territorial Banking Commission would receive a copy of the proceedings for their review of Greer's practices. It was not the destruction of Silas Greer. He would recover some portion of this through the 30 years of relationships and the careful management he'd always practiced. But it was a fracture, visible, public, permanent, in the edifice he'd built, and Evelyn thought that was probably more meaningful than any single financial outcome. She was gathering her papers after the room cleared when Douglas Crane appeared beside her. He'd been in the back, which she hadn't known until now. "You came," she said. "Eleanor told me not to," he said. "She said my being here would make it look political." "She was right," Evelyn said. "I know." He looked toward the door where Greer had exited with Aldred. "I've done business with that man for 20 years." "I know," she said. "He managed my father's estate for a period." He said it carefully, the way you say things you've been sitting with for a while. "I'll need someone to look at those records." She looked at him. "I can recommend Pell's approach." "I was thinking of a more direct source," he said. He held her gaze for a moment. "If you had time, at some point." "I'll make time," she said. He nodded once, the Douglas Crane version of a deep bow, and left. She finished gathering her papers and went to find Colton, who was in the hallway outside with the particular stillness of a man who has just finished something that started a long time before the thing itself began. "Your father," she said when she reached him. "Yeah," he said, not agreeing with a specific statement, just acknowledging what they were both thinking about. She stood beside him in the hallway of a converted meeting hall in a small Wyoming town, and she thought about a young man of 28 who'd inherited a ranch and a set of financial relationships from a dying father, and trusted them because trust was the only thing available when you were grieving and overwhelmed and trying to hold an empire together with your hands. She thought that the particular vulnerability of that moment was what Greer had counted on, and that the specific cruelty of counting on it was the thing that had driven her, beneath all the practical arguments, through every document and every meeting and every careful preparation. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. They married in December, 3 weeks before the solstice, when the Wyoming cold had fully settled into its winter authority, and the hills around Silvercrest were the particular pale gold of frozen grass under a sky that offered no pretense of warmth. The ceremony was in the main room of Silvercrest, which Margaret had organized with the practical efficiency she brought to everything: cleared furniture, borrowed chairs from the bunkhouse, a fire built high enough to heat the room properly. It was attended by the ranch hands, by Douglas and Eleanor Crane, by Warren Pell, by Ellis Vance and his wife, by Sam Briggs, who had fully recovered and ridden 40 miles to be present, and by the deputy marshal who'd brought the news about Doyle and who seemed genuinely glad to be there. Evelyn wore the blue wool dress. Margaret had altered it twice more since the celebration. It fit now the way good clothing was supposed to fit, neither demanding attention nor apologizing for itself. She stood beside Colton in front of the Justice of the Peace from Harlan, and she thought about the train platform in Pittsburgh and the fraudulent letter and the bandits on the road and the catastrophic desk in the study and the northeast fence and the courtroom and all the specific, unglamorous, difficult work that a life was made of when you were paying attention. She thought that she had not come here looking for this. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go, and that distinction mattered to her because it was true, and she had always preferred truth to the cleaner story. But she had also, somewhere between the fraudulent letter and this moment, found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not rescue, not stability in the passive sense, but a place where her particular way of being in the world was not an inconvenience or a provocation, but a contribution. A man who looked at her directness and her stubbornness and her habit of reading things from a distance and said, more or less, yes, that, keep doing that. The Justice of the Peace asked if she took this man. Yes, she said. Same word she'd said at the edge of the fairground. She meant it the same way, completely, without performance. Colton's jaw did not do the pain management thing. His face was simply open, in the particular way of someone who has put down something they've been carrying for a long time and is discovering what it feels like to have their hands free. When it was done, Margaret cried in the precise, controlled way of a woman who had decided she was allowed to cry at this specific thing and not others. Pete shook Colton's hand with both of his, which was the most demonstrative gesture she'd seen from him. Eleanor Crane embraced Evelyn with the warmth of someone who had decided, some time ago, to be fond of her and had been waiting for an appropriate moment to express it fully. Douglas Crane shook her hand and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his version of the most genuine thing he could offer. Rosa brought food from the kitchen, a quantity of it that made clear she had been planning this for longer than anyone had told her to. And the main room turned into the kind of gathering that happens when people have been through something difficult together and are registering, in the presence of warmth and food and each other, that they came through it. Colton found her near the window, near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had settled into comfortable conversation and the fire had burned down to a steady, reliable heat. "I have something for you," he said. She looked at him. He produced an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out. She opened it. Inside was a formal document, Silvercrest Ranch letterhead, properly witnessed and notarized, establishing her as joint owner of the ranch and all its operations, with full legal standing in all financial and business matters pertaining to the property. She read it twice. The document was specific in the way she'd taught him to be specific, leaving nothing to inference or goodwill. "This is—" She stopped. "Legal," he said. "Pell drafted it. I wanted it done before winter." She looked at the document in her hands and thought about what it meant, not just the legal fact of it, but the understanding it represented. That what she brought to this place was not a courtesy to be extended and withdrawn, but a foundation to be built on. That he saw it that way, had chosen to make that scene official and permanent and witnessed. "You didn't need to do this," she said. "No," he said. "I wanted to." She folded the document carefully and put it in the envelope and held it for a moment. Outside the window, the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, sitting on everything without apology, enormous and cold and indifferent. She had stopped finding it unsettling sometime in October. Now it seemed simply like the honest truth of a place that didn't try to be smaller than it was. The pre-1881 records, she said. He looked at her. What about them? I finished them last week, she said. Everything is clean. The Bennett supply contract is holding at the new rate. The banknote is resolved. The Douglas Crane estate records. I've agreed to review those in January. She looked up from the envelope. The ranch is in order, Colton. Really in order. I know it is, he said. So what's next? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone, Pete, she thought, from the voice, laughed at something, the full and easy laugh of a man at a celebration rather than a watch. There's a parcel north of the Morrison claim, Colton said. Morrison pulled up stakes in September. The water rights are good, and the grazing's excellent. I've been thinking about acquiring it. The north access would improve the spring cattle movement, she said immediately. I know. I'd want to look at the financing. I can have a projection by Thursday. I wasn't asking you to start tonight, he said, with the almost laugh. I know, she said. I'm telling you I can. She looked at him. That's what you have. Yes, he said. That's what I have. The fire held, the room held. Margaret appeared with 2 cups of something warm and pressed them into their hands with the expression of a woman who had run a household long enough to know when people needed to stop talking about ranches and drink their coffee. Evelyn drank hers and looked at the people in the room, these specific, flawed, difficult, generous people who had become, without her planning it, her people. And she thought about a thing her father used to say when a business problem resolved in a way nobody had expected. The answer was always in the facts. You just had to be willing to follow them wherever they went. She had followed the facts from Pittsburgh to a train platform, to a stagecoach road, to a catastrophic desk in a Wyoming study. And the facts had led her here. She had not come looking for this. She had come because she had no alternative, and she had stayed because she found the work worth doing, and somewhere between those two things, the place had become hers, and the people had become hers, and the man beside her had become the most important fact she hadn't expected to find. That was not the story she would have told on the platform in Pittsburgh. It was the true one. Spring arrived the following April with the abrupt authority that Wyoming spring had. Not gradual, not polite, but a shift that happened between one week and the next, the ground suddenly expecting something from you again. Evelyn stood at the window of the study, her study, both their study. The distinction had dissolved sometime in January, with the morning light coming in at the angle she'd learned to track through the seasons, and she watched the hands moving in the yard below with the particular purposefulness of people who knew what they were about. She was 3 months along. She'd known for 6 weeks and had told Colton on a Sunday evening in February, sitting at the desk after supper, in the same direct way she told him everything. He'd been very still for a moment. Then he'd said, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said. "I feel fine. Better than expected." "Good," he said. The word contained considerably more than it appeared to. He'd reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance of feeling, just his hand over hers, solid and present. And they'd sat like that for a while without saying anything else, because sometimes the facts were sufficient and adding to them was only noise. Margaret had guessed before being told, because Margaret noticed the things she was supposed to notice and filed them appropriately. Rosa had responded to the news with the efficiency of someone immediately calculating kitchen modifications. Pete had said, "Good," in the same register he used for successful fence repairs, which was the highest register he had, and meant accordingly. Douglas Crane had shaken her hand again, which was becoming their language for the moments that mattered most. Eleanor had said, "About time the ranch had some growing to do in a different direction," and then had immediately produced a list of practical recommendations that Evelyn had found genuinely useful. Standing at the window now, watching the spring morning arrange itself over Silver Crest, Evelyn thought about the particular thing that life did when you weren't organizing it, the way it grew in directions you hadn't accounted for, put down roots in ground you'd thought was temporary, became itself without asking your permission. She had come here with $31 and a fraudulent letter, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided that rebuilding was just work. She had rebuilt. She was still rebuilding. That was what you did. But she had also learned something she hadn't come here knowing, that the people who tried to take things from you, the Gerald Fitches and Silas Greers and Hector Dunns, all counted on the same thing, that you would eventually stop looking carefully, that the work would overwhelm the attention, that trust, once extended, would not be examined. They were right about most people. They had been wrong about her, and she intended to go on being the kind of person they were wrong about. Below, Colton came out of the barn and looked up at the window. Not looking for her specifically, just the habit of checking the house in the morning, a thing she'd noticed him doing since October. He saw her there and raised one hand. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. There you are. She put her hand flat against the glass. Here I am. The spring light came across the Wyoming hills and did what it did. Indifferent, enormous, completely without interest in whether any of this mattered to it. But it was warm, for the first time in months, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture with the particular energy of animals let out after a long winter, and the records on the desk behind her were in order, and the parcel north of the Morrison claim had been acquired in February at terms she considered favorable, and the child she was carrying would be born into a place that was genuinely, solidly, undeniably home. She had not built that from nothing. She had built it from the specific, unglamorous daily work of showing up and paying attention and refusing, consistently and without drama, to accept a smaller version of what she knew to be true. That was not a remarkable thing. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, the oldest thing, the thing that every generation hands to the next, whether they know it or not. You show up, you do the work. You look at what's actually in front of you, not what you were told would be there. And when someone hands you a fraudulent letter and calls it an exceptional opportunity, you read it 3 times and board the train anyway, because the destination was always your own. The morning held. Silvercrest held. Evelyn Hart Ashford turned from the window, sat down at the desk, and opened the ledger to the page she'd been working on. There was always more to do.